Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, I want to tell you a story that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. A story about cold nights, quiet courage, and the kind of strength that doesn't shout but whispers at exactly the right moment. It begins on a winter evening when the city seemed to hold its breath, when the air bit through jackets and the streets emptied faster than usual, and when fate quietly brought 3 fragile lives and 1 guarded soul into the same frozen moment. He stood under a flickering streetlight near the old bus terminal, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn coat, eyes scanning the street the way they always did, automatically, like a habit carved into him by years he didn't talk about. People who passed him would never guess he had once moved through deserts and oceans with a team that trusted him with their lives. These days, he moved through crowds unnoticed, and that suited him just fine. The world had taught him that silence was safer. He'd learned how to disappear, how to keep his past folded away like a map you don't want anyone else to see. The cold had a way of pulling memories to the surface though. It reminded him of nights spent watching the horizon, of breath fogging inside a mask, of the promise he'd made to himself when it was all over that he'd keep moving forward, no matter how heavy the past felt. He took a slow breath and exhaled, watching the steam drift up and vanish. That was when he noticed them. At first, it was just movement at the edge of his vision, a small cluster of shapes near the bus stop bench. Then he heard the sound, a soft sniffle followed by a shiver that wasn't just from the wind. He turned slightly, careful not to startle, and saw a woman wrapped in a thin coat that looked like it had been through too many winters already. Beside her were 2 children, pressed close, their small hands buried in the pockets of her coat, their faces red from the cold. He knew that look. Not just cold, not just tired, but the kind of exhaustion that comes from holding it together for too long. The woman's eyes kept darting to the street and then back to her kids, calculating, hoping, bracing. She was trying to be AWOL against the cold and the world at the same time, and walls like that eventually crack. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself there were shelters, programs, people whose job it was to help. He told himself he'd learned the cost of stepping in when you didn't have to. But his feet didn't listen. They carried him a few steps closer, and he stopped again, pretending to check his phone, giving himself time to decide whether to keep going or walk away. The younger child coughed, a small, dry sound that echoed too loudly in the quiet. The older one tried to rub their hands together, copying something they'd probably seen on TV, but it didn't help much. The woman whispered something to them, her voice steady but thin, like ice stretched too far. That was when he heard himself speak, low and calm, the way he'd learned to talk when panic was nearby. "Come with me." The words were barely louder than the wind, but they cut through it. The woman looked up, startled, fear flashing across her face before she masked it. Years of watching danger had taught her to be careful. He lifted his hand slightly, palms open, a universal sign that he meant no harm. "There's a place nearby," he continued, keeping his voice even. "Warm. You don't have to stay long, just until you can feel your fingers again." She hesitated, and he didn't rush her. He knew trust wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned, moment by moment. Finally, she nodded. Just once, and gathered her children closer. He turned and started walking slowly, making sure they followed by the sound of their footsteps behind him. The place he led them to wasn't fancy. It was a small community center tucked between a closed hardware store and a laundromat, the kind of place people overlooked. He knew it because he'd spent a few nights there himself, when the memories were too loud and the future felt too far away. The lights were on, and warmth spilled out as soon as he opened the door. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and old books. A volunteer behind the desk looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes when she saw him. He gave a small nod, a silent request. She didn't ask questions. She just smiled at the kids and handed them cups of hot chocolate like it was the most natural thing in the world. The children's hands trembled as they wrapped their fingers around the cups, and the woman let out a breath she'd been holding for days, maybe weeks. She guided them to a table and sat down, shoulders sagging as the heat finally reached her bones. He stood off to the side, not wanting to intrude, but she looked up at him again. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I didn't know what else to do tonight." He shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "You did what you had to," he replied. "That counts for something." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that doesn't need filling. Then she told him her story. Not all at once, not in a rush, but piece by piece, like she was testing whether the words were safe to let out. Her husband had passed away, leaving behind more questions than answers. The bills piled up, the rent slipped away, and suddenly, the ground under her feet wasn't solid anymore. She'd been strong for her kids, she said, but strength didn't keep you warm at night. He listened without interrupting, nodding when it felt right. He didn't offer solutions he couldn't guarantee. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He just listened, and sometimes that was the most powerful thing a person could do. The older child looked up at him suddenly, eyes curious. "Are you a soldier?" the child asked, innocent and direct. He paused, then smiled softly. "I was," he said, "a long time ago." "Did you fight bad guys?" the child pressed. He thought about the question, about how simple it sounded, and how complicated the answer really was. "I tried to help people," he said finally. "Sometimes that meant fighting. Sometimes it meant listening." The child nodded, satisfied, and went back to sipping the hot chocolate. The woman watched him closely, something like relief softening her features. As the night went on, the center filled with a few more people escaping the cold. The volunteer brought over blankets, and the kids wrapped themselves up like little burritos, giggling for the first time since he'd seen them. The sound warmed him in a way the heater never could. When it was time to leave, he walked them outside again, the cold less sharp now that they were bundled up and had a plan. He gave the woman directions to a shelter that would have space in the morning, and he wrote down a number she could call if she needed help navigating the system. She took the paper like it was a lifeline. "I don't even know your name," she said. He hesitated. Names had weight, but tonight, it felt right to share. He told her, and she smiled, repeating it like she wanted to remember. They parted ways under the same flickering streetlight, but the night felt different now. As he walked home, his steps felt lighter, like something he'd been carrying had shifted just a little. Days passed, then weeks. Winter pressed on, relentless, but he found himself stopping by the community center more often, helping where he could, fixing a broken door, shoveling snow, showing up. One afternoon, he saw the woman again, this time inside, her kids laughing as they worked on a puzzle at a table. She looked stronger, steadier, like someone who had found a foothold. She waved him over, gratitude shining in her eyes. "We got a place," she said. "It's small, but it's ours." He smiled, feeling a quiet pride that surprised him. "That's good," he said. "You did that?" "We did," she corrected gently. "You were there when it mattered." He shook his head, but he didn't argue. Some moments didn't need debate. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, he realized something had changed in him too. The past still existed, the memories still came, but they didn't feel as heavy. Help in that family hadn't erased what he'd been through, but it had given it a new shape, a new purpose. One evening, as he walked past the bus terminal again, he paused under the streetlight and looked around. The city buzzed with life, people rushing by, each carrying their own unseen stories. He knew there would always be cold nights and hard choices, but he also knew this, that sometimes all it took was a whisper, a simple invitation, and the courage to stop and care. And if this story reminds you that kindness doesn't have to be loud to be powerful, that strength can be gentle, and that even the smallest moment of help can change a life, then maybe it's done what it needed to do. Thanks for being here, thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.